Hi guys, and welcome back to Unfollowing Mum. Today I have a really exciting guest that I am so pleased to be speaking to. I am going to be introducing this lady who's going to chat to us about her experience with estrangement. I'd mentioned before when I did the intro to this podcast that sometimes I will speak to specialists and therapists, and sometimes I will speak to people who have lived experience of estrangement, because I think having a mixture is really important for people to know that they are not alone in these experiences, and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with talking about and sharing your lived experience within community. So without further ado, I am super excited to speak to Helene Rabbitt. Hi, how are you?
Hello, good morning. I'm
Good
okay, thank you.
morning.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and for speaking to me. Can you give listeners an idea of who you are, what you do, and what your experience has been? It's a big ask, isn't it? It's a lot.
Oh, there's a long old story there. So I am Helene Rabbitt. I teach part-time, so I'm a teacher. I teach at a school in Leeds, and I also do social media management for a fabric company, which is kind of part of my love, as well as is sewing and making quilts and generally being very creative. I have two children. I'm married. My children are 5 and 6, and we live in Leeds and live a fairly kind of straightforward life, which is really lovely, because there is enough drama has happened, and I think that's the big thing about estrangement, is that you have a situation where you have loads and loads of stuff coming at you, and then you actually have a little moment of clarity and think, actually, do you know what, I'm calling a halt to this.
Yeah.
And then there is a very strange period afterwards. I became estranged from my mum initially at the beginning. I think it was kind of like mid 2020.
Same time
So,
as me then.
I mean, of all the times
Yeah.
to do it, it was, I suppose, maybe it was indicative of the time. My mum, and I don't really like you calling her that, but I don't want to call her by her name. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? For this, I do generally when I'm communicating with kind of social workers and that kind of thing, because I can't actually bring to give her that title, which I think is another interesting point.
Yeah, that is actually, and it's something that I've come across before. Somebody referred to their mum, and I see it quite a lot with people refer to dads as like my sperm donor. And I see that quite a lot. And then I'd seen somebody refer to their mum as the incubator, and it created a bit of a kickback on TikTok. But I got it. I really did get it, because it was almost like I can't bring myself to think of her in that role, because that role's an important role. That role's something that matters. And it's really hurtful when you've had somebody who is meant to have fulfilled that role
And
has
when
actually
you're
done quite the
fulfilling
opposite.
that role.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think it changes when you become a parent yourself as well. You start to look even further and think, well, hang on a minute. I'm doing this now.
Yeah.
What the hell were you doing?
Yeah.
And so I completely relate to that. I do. I completely relate to that.
And I think just making that difference, because there are so many other people in my life who have been a mum to me than she ever was.
Yeah.
So it always smarts a little. So in the kind of, we became estranged in 2020, and there was kind of a point where it all came to a head, which was that she's always had issues with alcohol and drinking, and has been in and out of hospital over various times. You know, she's been detoxed from alcohol maybe 8 or 9 times in hospital, and that has had just the most incredible wearing effect on everybody, in that you just, you accept that it's an illness and you want her to get better from that. However, she's just as bad when she's not drinking. So it's not the alcohol that's the issue. She was just as narcissistic and kind of toxic when she wasn't drinking as when she was. And that led to a point where kind of March 2020, when everybody was shutting their doors, she accused us of stealing from her. And so at the beginning of lockdown, all of our bank accounts were locked.
Oh,
Two small
wow.
children, a pandemic, and no access to any money. So we were investigated by the police. We were investigated by like I can't remember what they're called, but like the fraud team that looks at
Yeah.
people who kind of take money from elderly people.
Wow.
And everything was above board and fine. We hadn't stolen from them, which we
Yeah.
knew anyway. But in that situation, it was incredibly stressful, and things that kind of led up to that. And since stopping being in touch with her, what I've realized is you cannot deal with trauma if you're still in it.
Yeah.
You can't, because you're still fending it off and you're still trying to deal with it. And I had to stop everything to be able to start to deal with it. And that has probably been the hardest thing that I've had to deal with. Hardest thing about it I've had to deal with, because as a kid, living in that toxic environment where, God, I mean, she used to take me to the doctors to get me weighed. She would restrict food. She would encourage me to eat alone in my bedroom, away from her and my dad. She was incredibly controlling and just like vitriolic with the comments that she would make about what kind of person I was, what kind of person other relatives were.
Mm.
And got to a point where I just thought, actually, do you know what? I am not exposing my kids to this.
Yeah.
And like my conception story of them getting pregnant with me is very, very rocky. They had, numerous miscarriages. I don't know if mum was drinking at the time. I had a really tough time, didn't speak to each other for the entire time that mum was pregnant. I came into the world and was not what I think they expected. And
Right.
and living with being told, you've changed your dad and I's relationship, those kind of little phrases that you remember over time that you wouldn't even dream of saying. And thank God you think it's weird. Do you know what I mean? Thank God you think, actually, I would never say that.
Yeah, it's funny because, and this is purely my own theory. I've not come across any research done into it specifically, but I think a lot of the older generation that are sort of what you class as boomers or the silent generation, it wasn't socially acceptable to not have kids unless you physically couldn't have kids.
Yeah.
Everybody, the whole goal of life was finish school at 15, get a job, get married, have the white picket fence and 2 kids. Or, maybe you can get away with one, but there'll be a bit of stigma around that. And that's, I mean, that's a whole other podcast because there is still stigma around that.
And I'm an only child.
Yeah, I am. And funnily enough, my parents had triplets before me that passed away. And I think that deeply impacted both of them.
Yeah.
Deeply impacted both of them as it would, of course it would, but I think I was so desperately wanted, and then when I came along, it was like very similar to what you've just described there, and my mum used to say similar to me. I mean, my parents divorced when I was nearly 4, and I used to get lots of, well, having a child does change your relationship, and I remember asking her once, does that mean I'm the reason you got divorced? And she'd said, no, of course not. That was because your dad couldn't keep it in his pants, kind of thing, which, I mean, true. But there was a lot more to it, I think, than just that. And that was an awful thing for a 3-4-year-old to hear. And I drew my own conclusions, as children always do. But I do genuinely think that generation, because it wasn't socially acceptable not to have children, many of them didn't actually want to. Maybe they would have wanted, how we hear that I remember being in college and doing business studies, and it was referred to as the jet ski versus child argument. Where does your finance go? What is your life goal? Are you going to be wealthy and not have kids? Or are you going to have kids and then they're going to cost you a lot of money? Where it's like societally, there is usually one throughout each generation which has been preferred or considered the norm. And for our parents' generation, it was the norm to have children. And then these kids come along and it's like, I didn't actually want this. And you hear it so
Yeah.
much in the language that's used of I've sacrificed for my child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like anybody out there who's heard that one will relate, knowing that, you know, I've sacrificed everything for you. I've given up everything for you.
Oh my God. Yeah. I gave up a really good career to have
Yes.
you.
Yeah, exactly. And you look and you think, well, fuck me. Like,
Yeah.
I don't look at my kids. I mean, yes, I've been incredibly fortunate, but I deliberately set out to build what I have built around my children so that I could be there for them more. I could have done anything that I wanted to do, but wanted to forge that career around them, because all I ever wanted really growing up was to have kids
Yeah.
and to be with my kids. And I think
Yeah.
unless you were 100% wanting to have children and wanting to be a mother or a father or whatever, and that was your goal, you've got a generation of people who thought they wanted kids and then actually really didn't.
Yeah. And you were very wanted is another kind of phrase that she would toss around.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she found it very difficult when I got pregnant. Because it happened relatively easily. There was, it was fine. We got pregnant. We had a baby. We're very, very lucky in that respect. And then with my second, we thought that I was having a miscarriage, and I was at home, and Chris came home from work, and I think I'd been on the phone to my dad or something, and he said, do you want us to come over? And I was like, I really, really don't want you to come over. Please don't come over. Just leave us. We've got a scan tomorrow. Let's see what happens tomorrow. And I mean, I was sat on the sofa bleeding, it was just visceral. And they turned up at the doorstep, and I was just like, and my mum walked in. And I remember Chris talking to her and saying, look, she really doesn't want to see anybody. We'll go in for the scan first thing tomorrow morning. We'll be in touch. And she said, yeah, but what about my miscarriages? Like, what? I'm sorry. What about yours? Okay, what about yours? Right. And I remember sitting on the sofa overhearing this conversation going on and thinking, I'm going to have to get up and ask them to leave. So I got up and I asked them to leave, and I said, you need to go home now.
Yeah.
And my dad was like, why do we need to go? Well, I told you not to come because of this reason. And I think she found it really, really hard to accept. And then everything was fine. The scan was fine. It was, he was absolutely fine. And she just could not get her head around it.
Did you feel like there was that resentment there that everything had been fine for you, but not for her?
I think so, yeah.
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 Which is really sad in and of itself. But it's very classic of that kind of enmeshed parent who can't see that you are a completely different person to them.
Yeah.
Who can't accept that not everything is about them. And that, I mean, like you say, it wasn't about her in that moment. And I think a normal reaction for anyone would be, are you okay? And perhaps to respect that boundary that you'd set and said, please don't come. And I can see, look, there might be people listening thinking, well, if my child was in that agony, I would ignore them and I would go because I'd want to be there for them. And I understand that reaction. I do understand that reaction. But there was a reason that you asked her not to go, because you knew she wouldn't be there for you. You knew that she'd make it about her and her experiences. And that's just so common when dealing with that sort of toxic parent, that narcissistic parent that can't differentiate between your experience and what you're going through, their experience, and then somehow has to kind of one up you. But my experience was worse. It was so much worse. And you're just a bit like, but you're not living that right now, and I need you to be here. Yeah. It's really difficult.
I mean, if I'd said, I don't want you to come, and she had come and she'd said, look, I just want to be here. Let me just refill the dishwasher.
Yeah.
Let me do that. And I'll make you a cup of tea. And then I promise you I'm going to go. And I love you very much. And give me a ring as soon as you know tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's a different way of handling it, isn't it?
It is. And again, it might be kind of ignoring that boundary of saying, please don't come. And it might not be necessarily the ideal thing, but it would be done out of love and out of a desire to make sure that you were okay. And I think that's when it's a very different scenario. But it's not done like that when it's a parent who's narcissistic or who's toxic or even emotionally immature, who cannot accept that this situation, whilst it might be their baby that's going through it, it's not them that's going through it. And that's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
So everything was fine with baby, which is wonderful.
Absolutely fine. Gave birth to him at 37 weeks and he was £9.6. And
are you okay?
I'm fine now. Yeah, she came to see him in the hospital and couldn't pick him up because she'd been drinking. And it kind of all started, I think, probably with that was kind of a big like red flag in my head. You make the decision that you're going to stop. You're going to stop contacting them. So what happened was she ended up being detoxed from alcohol, and what would happen was she would be able to make decisions for herself when she was sober and in the hospital, and then she would get discharged from hospital, go home and drink, and then she would end up back in hospital because she would hurt herself, and then they'd detox her and assess her as being fine, having mental capacity, and they would keep ringing me and I would be the person that would get in touch. They would get in touch with, and I would go to the hospital. And I remember once going to the hospital and it was like 6 weeks. She was on like a 6 weeks rolling cycle of ending up in hospital. And this very, very lovely nurse at Harrogate Hospital saying to me, do you think you could bring your mum some clothes in? Maybe some, just some underwear or something? Because she really does just have what she's come in, which is a nightie, and she's been in for 2 weeks. And I remember saying, no, I won't be going and getting her personal belongings from her house because I've done that before and she's rung the police. And this nurse just being like,
wow.
Okay. And I said, if I go and I buy her some clothes, then you need to know that she will just discharge herself and she'll leave. And her response was kind of like, yeah, but she's your mum.
Yeah. I'm sure groans.
Yes, she is.
Yeah, I'm sure the groans of recognition will be aplenty hearing that phrase, because it's used to excuse so much damaging behavior.
Yeah.
And, if you'd have been called because, say, an ex-partner had been in that state, and they'd have said, look, thank you for bringing them in. Is there any way you can get clothes? And you'd have said, I can't go to his house or her house because they'll call the police and I can't do that. And if I buy clothes, they'll just discharge themselves and go off with them because that's what they've done in the past. You would be like, why are you even here? You need to protect yourself from that. Who else can we call? Do you have any contacts? You would never turn around and say, but it's your ex-partner. It's your irresponsible.
It sounds a man that you met on the bus. It's a man that you met on the bus. So?
It sounds ridiculous to say it when you put it in the context of any other relationship. And yet when it comes to parents, and I've found the more people that I speak to, because I had a very toxic relationship with both parents, but the more people that I speak to, especially about toxic relationships with mums, seems to be so much more common when it's your mother. The societal acceptance of the deadbeat dad or the neglectful dad.
Which is horrendous.
It is, but that kind of comes across a bit more like, oh yeah, well, so dads are rubbish sometimes, aren't they? Yeah, dads are also amazing sometimes, and mums are rubbish sometimes. But it seems to be so much more that we can go, yeah, okay, dad might have been a bit of a shit, but it's your mum. And it's such a frustrating dismissal of everything else that relationship and that trauma that relationship can cause, because it might
undervalues those good relationships that you have.
Absolutely.
Because why would you stick around for it? I mean, you just wouldn't, and you shouldn't. And I'm not saying that it's easier on the other side of it, but it's definitely calmer. Like, I absolutely hate Mother's Day. Like, Mother's Day is just horrendous. Mother's Day, birthdays, Christmas, any time where there may be and actually that's probably something in the past week or so, I can anticipate that there will be a birthday card sent through. Probably not for me, actually. She will send a Christmas card. She won't send a birthday card. I kind of now have to have a policy for what I'm going to do with those things when they turn up. And sometimes I open them. And when I open them, I look at her handwriting and I see does she have capacity? Is she drinking? Because I can tell that from what I can see. And unfortunately, the post is the only thing that you cannot really stop without moving house. You know, you can, I made it so on my phone, her number would always go to voicemail, but then she would leave a voicemail and it would just be abusive. So then I turned my voicemail off totally so that she cannot leave a voicemail, and then blocked her number because I just thought I can't have that little tiny window of contact. And at the weekend, I was in the house on my own, and a nurse rang up and said, "Hiya, I'm just going round to your mum's house and can't find it. Can you tell me where it is?" I was like, well, the last time I did this, the police ended up getting involved, but, you know, I understand I can direct you to the house. So directed her kind of to the house because the house is quite hard to find. And I said, "You mustn't, please don't tell my mum that you've spoken to me. I'm just helping you out as you would another person in the street. Don't say anything to her anyway." So she rang back 2 minutes later. "I'm knocking on the door, but there doesn't seem to be any answer. Is that normal for your mum? Will she be okay? Do you think you could come round?" I was like, no, I won't be coming round. And also, how have you got my number? And of course, because I'm an only child and I'm still her next of kin, my telephone number is just everywhere, all over her paperwork, because in an ordinary situation, you want people to be able to get in touch with the next of kin. You don't want to be a nurse on the doorstep and be unable to. And I understand that. But that this week has properly floored me. And I don't really know why. I think it's because you build yourself a little bubble when you estrange from somebody, and you do everything that you can to make sure that there is no contact. So like her social worker knows only to get in touch with me when she's dead. The home that my dad is in know only to get in touch with me when he's dead or she's dead. Everybody that I possibly can knows where they're at with it, apart from NHS, who just find my number and ring. And those little chinks in the armor are really, really important, and they just floor me now because it makes me reel and go back to thinking all the awful things that I have spent a long time in therapy trying to get to the bottom of. They just spring back up again because it's so ingrained. That poisonous relationship is absolutely ingrained in every fibre of your body.
It is. It's completely. So if for anybody who hasn't heard the term CPTSD, it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is pretty much what you're describing there, where it's that you have those flashbacks, you have those memories, you have those written into the very fibre of your being. Actually,
it's a molecular level, and I know that because I know that it was happening when she was pregnant with me.
It's weird, isn't it?
There, all the time, and it influences too much of everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, as you said before, about not being able to heal that trauma whilst you're still in that trauma.
Yeah,
it's so true. It's so true, because when you are constantly bombarded, so anybody who kind of wants to look into CPTSD, I would recommend speaking to a therapist or a professional, as always. But that is something that is so common when you've lived with a toxic parent. And it's not always the case at all, but it's something that I started to research and started to look into and started to try and understand because of that very, like you say, that molecular level written into the very fabric of who I am, because you stay in this situation. And with PTSD, it's kind of an event that might be traumatizing. With CPTSD, it's an extended period of time of trauma and of toxic behavior and of triggering, damaging stuff that writes itself into the fabric of who you are. And it's so common when you've had a traumatic childhood over an extended period of time with a toxic parent. And it does, like you say, those moments of contact, those little snippets where you haven't just managed to block, where you haven't managed to write them out of your life entirely, it brings everything up again. I know Mum used to, she's obviously, our estrangement was in June 2020. And that sort of first last November and January, where it was Toby's, mine and Edith's birthdays, we got nothing, nada. And then Ruben's birthday came up and she sent him a birthday card. And I remember being like, because I was so shocked, because I thought, right, well, she's not done it for the other two. Surely she wasn't cruel enough to do it to Ruben, but she really zoned in on my eldest. Yeah. So then the following birthdays, November, Toby got a card, Edith got a card in January, and I got a card. And I remember it clear as anything. Me and Adam were arguing. We were going through a really rough patch anyway, and we were arguing, and he was just about to storm through the door and this letter dropped through. And I just remember his face, because it just changed it, because he knew what impact that would have. And he didn't want to give it to me. And it was in a pink envelope. And I knew as soon as I saw it, and we get, I'm 34 now, so I don't get many birthday cards. My kids get like an array of birthday cards, but anybody who would send me a birthday card either will just send me a text message, or people who are perhaps older and would have done, they've passed away now. So I don't get much by way of birthday cards. And I knew as soon as I saw the flash of pink, I was like, I know who that's from. I just knew. It was like you say, on that molecular level, I could sense it. And he sort of picked it up and held it and looked at me, and you could see it going through his mind of, I'm really pissed off with her. She's absolutely raging at me. Yeah. And I don't want to give it to her, but she's seen it now. And if I don't give it to her, that's going to be a problem. And if I do give it to her, that's going to be a problem. Like, how do I navigate this when I'm fuming? And he just sort of put it on the table. And then, when you're at an impasse where, you're really irritated with each other, but something else has happened that you're just like, I'm going to have to deal with this before we deal with that.
And while you were having that argument with him, that will have been influenced
100%.
by her, because it was you that was having the argument. And then she just intrudes.
Yeah. 100%.
And just lands on the doorstep.
Yeah.
Oh,
100%. Funnily enough, whenever we argue, and it's interesting that you say it will be influenced by that, because if Adam loses his temper, he tends to raise his voice, and shouting for me is deeply triggering.
Yeah, me
and
too.
I will I will do one of two things. My brain, and I can feel it happening, disassociates.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a slow trickle where I'm starting to can't hear him properly. And I can't remember what the word he said before he's just said the word. And I'll repeat something back to him that he's just said to me. And he's like, I didn't say that. Yeah. And then he gets more frustrated.
Yeah.
But I can't hold the thought. I would need to sit and record it and go over it again, so that I could be like, this is where this problem because as soon as his voice starts to raise, my heart starts to go, my hands get sweaty, and
the adrenaline kicks in, and I shut down, and I become 8 years old and being told off.
Yes. And my mum always used to say, I know I shouted a lot when you were younger. I didn't hit you very often, but I shouted a lot. And I've got to be honest and say, and I said this to somebody once, they were really shocked. I would have taken the time she grabbed me by the throat in Asda. I would have taken the time she hit me with a slipper, or the time she chased me up the stairs screaming at me and then laughed at the bottom because I was so frightened I hid in the bathroom. I would have taken all those times over one shouting at.
Yeah.
Over one, because it has impacted me so much as an adult. If a stranger were to shout at me, I'm not so bad, but it's someone that I have a close relationship with, and
you have a
close
connection with
bond.
somebody.
I can't bear shouting in that environment, in that manner. And it's heavily influenced, even down to how you communicate with your partner, like even down to, because I can be quite independent. I don't like asking for help, and it's a bit of a running joke now, because if I want to do something, even if I know it's going to be difficult, and Adam could probably do it in a second, I'll just try and do it myself rather than ask him. And he's always like, why didn't you wait for me to get all that stuff down for the loft, or why didn't you do this? And I'm like,
because I didn't want to put you out. I didn't want to ask.
Bingo. Because I didn't want to put you out, I didn't want to ask, and also I don't want to be reliant on you, because that gives you too much power over me.
take up any space.
Yes, exactly. And somebody had mentioned to me the other week about space and how people of our generation don't like to take up space because we were raised by people who told us not to, who told us that we needed to be, kids should be seen, not heard, and all of those things that we as parents now don't say to our children, wouldn't say to our children. I want you to be heard. I want you to have a voice. But then it was almost considered rude to have a voice, to be heard.
I struggle with silence as well, because what would happen is that as a family, we would connect by there being an argument. And then there would be like 3 weeks, a month of silence.
Silent treatment. It's a big one.
It makes
for
my
me.
stomach churn.
Yeah. Isn't it weird how these things have this, and it's a physical reaction that you have to them. It's so funny that you said that, because for me it's shouting and silent treatment. And silent treatment or sulking, I go into that fawn response where I'm trying to sort of say, even though I'm not the one in the wrong, trying to sort of say, is everything okay? How can I fix it? How can I make it better? And
have I done something wrong?
And you know, sometimes Adam will just be like, we've got better at communicating again since I've cut ties with my mother, and since everything has been upended in our relationship, we've looked at those things and got better at communicating and saying, okay, I'm not giving you silent treatment, I just need a bit of time to process.
I'm going to come back.
And I'm going to come back, and I'm not, you know, it sounds silly if you've not lived the experience. It sounds so silly, but I completely relate to that, I just need to take a breather. I'm not giving you silent treatment. This isn't going to drag out for days and days or weeks and weeks. I'm just processing. And that normal bit where after an argument or even after a disagreement, where you take a pause and you sort of say, okay, I'm moody as hell because this has irritated me, and we're going to work through it because we've both said our pieces now. We're going to sit with it for a bit and then either come back and apologize to each other for if we misspoke, or we're just going to let it fizzle. There doesn't need to be a resolution to every disagreement that you have, but we've stated our pieces, we're good. Even that normal little bit where you have that pause can send me into like oh my god, what's going on? And I know through the pandemic, Adam and I, especially after I'd asked my mum to leave, things were awful, and we argued a lot, and it's impacted Toby, our middle child, massively, because he now, even if we're kind of having like a little jokey disagreement, we'll be like, you're not arguing, are you? And I hate that that's happened, because that was a cycle that I couldn't quite get there and stop in time. And, you know, you've got to cut yourself a bit of slack for that and look at it and say, hey, that's where I've gone wrong. How can I repair that damage? How can I help him to see that that's happens sometimes in relationships, and that's okay, that everything is okay? But it goes back to that sort of poking the finger of blame. That's not what this is about. That's not what estrangement is about. It's about, are you able to take accountability for your actions? And if not, then I need to protect myself and set those boundaries, which is exactly what estrangement is. It's putting a boundary in place to know that you are safer.
Like for us, Chris comes from a great family, pretty dysfunctional, normal.
We've all got a bit of dysfunction.
And he was always saying to me, I was kind of, we've been together a long time. I was saying, I just want them both out of my life. I don't want to do this anymore. And he'd be saying, yeah, but come on, I'll take the strain. Bless him. He was like, I'll do the day-to-day stuff. You just tick along in the background and it'll be fine. And I can remember thinking, it's not going to be fine. No. It's definitely not going to be fine. And thinking, I really, really need to stand my ground on this and say, I don't want to see them anymore. And I can remember her coming out of hospital, and she had head lice. And we turned up at the house, and I mean, she was riddled with them. And it became very clear that somebody was going to need to do that level of intimate care for her. And she didn't want it, but obviously she didn't want an infestation of head lice either. And I remember Chris saying, you're going to have to help her with her hair. And the intimacy of that situation of helping her to wash her hair and put the head lice lotion on and comb through her hair and being in that close proximity to her and doing something that was incredibly caring, and I'm sure she felt very vulnerable at that point, was probably one of the worst things that he's asked me to, that he has in encouraging me to try and fix that relationship, has tried to do. And I remember sitting in the car afterwards and thinking, I am not doing this anymore. I cannot put myself in that vulnerable position and care for somebody who has systematically broken me down.
Yeah.
I can't do it. And said to him, look, I'm just not doing it anymore. And then there comes the point where you've decided that you're going to estrange from somebody, and you decided that you don't want to go in to be in their lives anymore. Do you tell them? Because I didn't. I just withdrew and stopped answering the phone. Like one layer of barrier, and then you just build them up and up and up. And like morally, it doesn't entirely sit comfortably with me. Ghosting somebody, is a bit of it's a tough one to square in your head, that you're just going to do it without saying anything. And I did it. I didn't say anything. I just totally withdrew because I just could not do anymore. Did you tell her?
Yeah, I did, because I had to, because she was living with us at the time. But do you not feel like you've told her enough? Do you not feel like you've said enough?
Yeah.
You've begged enough times for things to change.
Yeah.
You've asked. You've said, please, I can't cope with this relationship being like this. Behave differently around me. Think about how you're speaking to me. I'm not a dog. And you've said enough. I'd let go of it not sitting right with you that you've ghosted, because you've said enough.
Yeah.
You've said it so many times in so many different ways, and it's just never been heard.
Yeah.
And
we got to the point where I wasn't taking the kids to be in her company.
Yeah.
Because I just thought, this is not right.
Yeah.
And you try to do your best by somebody. And what has been totally wonderful is, and it sounds a bit weird, but like other people going, so my dad worked in the NHS. And my estrangement from him is an entirely different story. But I remember my dad was working in some of the mental hospitals in Leeds. There's some pretty full-on places.
Yeah.
And one of his friends would go and visit him. And I remember him ringing me, and I was saying to him, look, I'm not in touch with mum anymore. He said, well, we've got this saying in the NHS, they're either mad or they're bad. And I think you've just got a bad one there, Helene. You just need to not be in touch with her anymore. Wow. And I was like, you have been part of my life for my life. And you're saying that to me now.
Yeah.
Like
where was this before?
Yeah, where was this before? Yeah. And people saying, yeah, but, or people not knowing about her drinking, or getting into my cousin, I needed to get in touch with him and ended up being in touch with his mum, my auntie. So my mum's brother's wife, listening to her talk about that, seeing the relationship from the other side. So seeing me and remembering me at 10 and 11 years old, deciding what pudding I would like in the restaurant, and for my mum saying, oh, you're not having it. That relationship has just been restorative, because it was somebody who was there, and somebody who knows, and somebody who can go, oh my God, yes, I didn't know about that, but yes, that makes sense. And do you remember when this and this happened? And piecing it together just gives you that reassurance that you're not entirely bonkers.
Yeah.
That you didn't make it all up in your head.
You do think you've made it all up. You really do. Yeah. I haven't got anyone who can kind of sit there and say, do you remember this experience or that experience? It really was just me and my mum. And any of her family I wasn't close to anyway. I didn't really know, and they, I'm sure, would take her side. They don't know me. They wouldn't know me if they walked past me in the street. And my dad's side was not there either. My dad's sort of wife can attest to what a toxic person my mum was, but she was equally toxic. So, but for me, my mother-in-law was the person that came out with some really interesting things that I had no idea about. that like my mum at my baby shower had said to her, "You're not welcome here." And they could see the way in which my mum spoke to me, the way in which she impacted mine and Adam's relationship, the way in which she impacted me as a person, and how different and happy I seemed to be when I was not around her. And that's been really interesting, hearing her saying those things and hearing her point of view on that. But it is, like you say, restorative when, and I've spoken to people who've had similar experiences where someone's come out and said to them, yeah, we could see this, but we couldn't really say anything.
Yeah.
It is restorative because it
Yeah.
makes you realize, like the amount of times I've said to my therapist, well, what if I've made it worse in my head? Because that's what my mum would say to me. You've made that worse, or you've made that up in your head. And that's gaslighting. We know that. But you self-gaslight because that's what you've been brought up believing is the norm, is to be gaslighted. So you self-gaslight and you sit there going, well, what if I've made all this up and actually this poor woman's been cut off from me and from her grandkids and it's all in my head? It's not all in your head. And you know on a logical level that it's not. You know on a logical level that it's absolutely happened, that it was legitimate, but you don't fully trust yourself. And I think you lose that ability to trust your instincts and to trust your gut when you've been raised in that toxic environment.
And like on like a tiny level, I was in Morrison's, and both kids with me, you know, my kids at the time were probably 3 and 4. We've got a small age gap between them.
Yeah.
And you know what it's like when you're in a supermarket with a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, like one of them's bouncing around, somebody's licking the yogurts, and you know, it was all a bit flying by the seat of your pants. And it was in my hometown. I walked around the corner and there was my year 3 teacher. So the teacher that I'd had when I was 7 and 8. And I was like, oh, hi. And she was like, hello, Helen. How are you? Like, I'm okay, thanks. These are my kids. And she was like, just remind me, like, what year you were at school and when did I teach you? And, you know, like, I mean, it's a small town. How old were my children when I was teaching you? And I kind of filled in the gaps, and she went, oh, yeah, you're the one whose mum. And I was like, what? Yeah. And she just didn't finish it. And I was just thinking, oh, tell me what that was. Is there a way of finding that out? Is it worth it?
No.
Like,
yes.
My perspective as a teacher, you log anything like that. Do you know what I mean? If I'd be writing it down somewhere, but in 1987, was anybody writing it down, or do I just need to wait until I bump into her in the supermarket again? And then I just got distracted by the kids, and it was just like, lovely to see you, bye. But those people that must have been witnesses to what was going on must have known something. And my relationship with the school, with my school, and was bizarrely strong in that, like, it was a school where everybody went on a residential pretty much from like year 2 onwards. Like every year there was a residential, and I used to come home and I'd be sitting on the bus sobbing because I didn't want to go home. Did not want to go home. Not because I'd had a lovely time, because I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to go back into that environment.
Yeah. See, funnily for me, it was the opposite. I had about a year at a school that I couldn't cope with the change. My primary school had shut down, and I went to this school that was just a small. My mum was quite keen to keep me in private schools, even though she couldn't afford it, which she would then later blame me for. Like it was my decision that she decided to try and keep up with the Joneses, because when my mum and dad were together, my dad was quite wealthy, and she very much would point out how he hoarded his wealth, how he didn't pay for my school bills and stuff. And you know, I really struggled when my little primary school shut down, and I had about a year before I could go to this big school that she'd bigged up so much. And actually I ended up leaving in year 8 because she couldn't keep paying the bills and my dad had refused. But this particular little school, I cried every day on the bus in because I didn't want to go, and no one could work out why. And then I remember her taking me to a therapist. She was very anti-therapist, and she insisted on sitting in the room. And I think I blocked out what actually happened. I remember him giving me the things that I have now learned are tools to handle CPTSD, where you will take yourself to a calming place. And they're tools to help a lot of things, but drawing the connection between them, because I think he could see that there was this complete enmeshment between me and my mum. And I think part of why I cried every day when I was asked to go at like a 9-year-old girl was because I was terrified that I wouldn't come home to anyone. And I was terrified that if I was out of my mum's sight, I didn't know who to be, what to do, how to behave. I just didn't know. I couldn't sleep over at friends' houses because what if she did what my dad had done and left? I think those were the fears of a little girl. I've still never really got down to the bottom of it because I've just sort of put it in a box and left it alone. But it was quite the opposite in what you say of crying because you were frightened to go home. I was almost frightened to leave because what if there was nothing there for me when I got back? And almost frightened to be away from her because of that enmeshment, because of that lack of identity in myself, lack of knowing who I was or how I should be, and a complete inability to deal with change. You know, they talk about children being quite adaptive, but when I was in that sort of 8-9 period, I wasn't adaptive at all. And I
am not changing anything.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And I've got better, but like, even through my work, I've dragged my heels on TikTok while everybody else was getting into TikTok and being like, I'm going to set up a TikTok account and I'm going to do TikTok. I was like, it won't last. I'm not getting involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, I went to test drive a car the other day and my driving license was 5 years out of date.
Really?
Because the thought of getting into trouble stopped me from making it better. That's a big thing.
Yeah, that avoidance.
Avoiding things because of fear is just paralyzing. It totally paralyzes you, especially when you haven't got the same toolkit as everybody else to be able to soothe yourself and make yourself feel better. Because you just haven't been equipped with it.
That's it, isn't it? You haven't been equipped with the toolkit that everyone else was. And when are you talking about emotional abuse? People don't get that it's so fundamental what we have in our younger years. It's so fundamental to how we will respond to things as an adult, how we will navigate adult life. That our needs are not being fulfilled when there's something that's missing, there's something that's lacking. You don't get that toolkit. It's like being given a box and being told to go and put some screws in with no screwdriver. And that sounds such a silly analogy, but it's so true.
It's so true.
You are missing those fundamental parts of what teach you how to be an adult in this society.
And it's the biggest contraceptive ever. Just think, I can't possibly have kids because I'll end up doing the same as what they did.
Yeah. You see, for me, I almost kind of rushed into wanting to have kids and wanting to get married. I was that desperate. And I remember actually, God, I've not thought about this for years. This is something to bring up in therapy, probably not on a podcast, but I'm going to share it with you all anyway. I remember turning to my mum, and if you'd have asked me 6 years ago, 10 years ago, I'd have said my mum was my best friend. We were that kind of intertwined with each other, and she wasn't at all. She was a covert narcissist. She was destroying my life. But if you'd have asked me, I was that blindsided. And I remember turning to her when I was pregnant with Ruben and saying, I just can't wait till he's here because I just want something to love that loves me. I should have brought that up in therapy instead of here. I'm going to need to unpack that one for a bit.
That is you teaching her, isn't it?
Yeah. And that should have been the earliest signs. And it wasn't until he was maybe 2, 3 that I realized, maybe a bit earlier actually, because I remember being sat on the sofa and I just had him, and she kept telling the nurse that I wasn't myself. And I
just given birth.
Fine. I was like, I'm doing it. Like, I'm okay. She's like, no, I think you're really blue, to the point where I burst into tears, and the nurse was like, it was the health visitor. Maybe you are a bit then. I was bloody fine until she kept going. But it was almost like she was trying to create that I couldn't cope so that she could step in and cope for me. And I was coping fine. I mean, okay, a week later I had sepsis, but that's because I was ignoring my needs.
Yeah, you were handling it.
And I was handling it.
You really were. You were handling it. And that's what's come out of therapy for me, is that you handle stuff. You deal with it. You deal with stuff. And have you had EMDR therapy?
No, for me, it's been person-led therapy.
EMDR has absolutely transformed, like, dealing with the trauma. Like you said, it's not one, like if you sat down and said, right, okay, I need to work through each individual individual episode of trauma, you'd be
You'd
it
never
would just
get
go
through
on.
it.
You never get through it because there's so many. And we did end up doing loads of work on like the bigger feeling of trauma.
Is EMDR the one that includes tapping?
Yeah.
Yes, so I have heard of this, and I've tried bits of it myself. But yes, so now I do know what you mean. And working on that bigger lack of self-worth, that bigger kind of issue, if you like, or that bigger trauma that has been left, as opposed to each individual little thing.
Yeah, and it has made a massive difference, huge difference in like feelings of self-worth and the bigger issues, but not necessarily the little triggers, so the silent treatment or the phone ringing and not knowing who it is. But the big stuff it's been really good for, and just reminding me that you are dealing with it and that you have some skills that are there that you can use to be able to deal with whatever life throws at you, because it doesn't have to throw you some curveballs.
Yeah.
But I think it's the lack of security, growing up with that lack of security and the lack of secure bonds that has probably floored me the most. Just not knowing and feeling at risk. And that's what you are with emotional abuse. You are at risk.
You are. And I think that's why it's so damaging, because you're at risk, but it's a hidden risk. We can see a fire, but can't see the central heating that's been turned up so high that you're literally baking.
Yeah.
And I think people don't acknowledge it in the same way. And you are at risk, and it is really damaging. And like you say, it's now that you are estranged and you're starting to work on that and you're starting to heal from that, it doesn't necessarily protect you from the little triggers.
No.
But it gives you a greater sense of self, I guess. Because I think that's what's stripped from you, is that sense of self.
Definitely. Not knowing who on earth you are, because you know how to behave when you're around your parents. You know what you can do and you know what will rub them up the wrong way. Take those out of the equation and you're a little bit lost. And I have felt like that. Estranging from them is feeling like a bit lost. Like, is it okay to be compassionate? Is it okay to care and to take the little bits of joy out of tiny little things? Is that okay? Nobody's going to tell me now that it's not. So
it's hard, isn't it? Because like you say, it's once you have estranged and once you've gone through that process, which is incredibly traumatic in itself.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, now I get to decide what I like.
Yeah.
Now I get to do these things. And I'm looking to me, and this is something I've had to work really hard on in therapy. I'm looking to me as the adult. And that sounds so ridiculous to say as a 34-year-old woman, but almost like before I would be not stopped from being the adult, but that I would have my adult decisions or thought processes or ideas or wants or goals questioned by somebody who I saw as knowing better than me.
Yeah, it has people in authority, I think, is another one that you just think, oh God.
Yeah, I don't. That is why I'm self-employed.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a fan of authority. I can push back against it and then sit with myself afterwards and be like, oh, why, Harriet? That didn't make any sense whatsoever. Why did you not like authority? What on earth is wrong with you? But I can find that quite difficult. And I think, like you say, it's all of a sudden you're the one that's having to think about these things. You're the one that's making decisions. You're pleasing yourself as well. And I think that in itself is a weird concept.
Yeah.
Because you're like, well, I want to go for a bath and I'm not having to think about, will the phone ring for this? Or will I need this? Or will that be questioned?
Be enough hot water for everybody else. If I go and have a bath, if I think about me, then is it going to be okay for everybody else?
Yeah.
And explaining that to and like just parenting. I mean, of course, parenting is going to be very, very triggering. Full stop. Of course, parenting, when you've been parented in the way that we have, is going to be extra triggering. And explaining those kind of things to your kids is just like, my kids are pretty good in knowing that my mum isn't very nice to be around, so therefore we're not. I'm proud of that.
I think you should be. And I mean, the same for me. It's been a little bit more. I'm not sure, how old are your kids now?
They are 5 and 6.
Okay, so mine are a little bit older, and Ruben in particular, he's had some really negative experiences where she seems to have honed in on him, and I think she recognizes a lot of me in him as a child, how I was easy to manipulate, and has tried that with him. But myself and Adam have very much been there to advocate for him and to say, that's not going to happen. That's not going to fly. We're not allowing that. But he's quite good at communicating how he feels around the topic of being estranged from her, because they had a really close relationship, or again, it mirrored my relationship with her in a way that it seemed really close, but actually after we cut ties with her, a lot of things came out where she would sit him down and say, I don't think daddy's the right person for mummy, or you mustn't tell mummy and daddy about this because they'll be angry with me and they'll be nasty. All of these things that, I mean, Jesus Christ, you just would not say to a child, let alone someone else's child, telling him to lie about things, encouraging him to watch things that were more grown up or be on his iPad while she was watching things that were grown up, and then just sort of say, oh, well, he's in my space, he's not watching it anyway, and just all these little things. But after we did estrange, she turned up at the school.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so she turned up at the school, and in a way I was so proud of him. In another way, it kind of broke my heart a bit. It was his final year at school, and she had arranged with someone that she'd befriended in the village to tell him, there's a surprise for you down at the bottom of the hill. And she was waiting down there, and Reuben had run down, spotted her, and she was trying to beckon him across the road, and I think he said he wouldn't go over the road, sort of made an excuse of, I'm not allowed to cross the road, or maybe he did, I can't quite remember now, maybe he did go over the road to her, and he'd spoke to her and she'd said, I'll be here tomorrow as well, we'll have secret meetings, which in and of itself is insane. And Reuben was able enough at the age of sort of 10 to spot his siblings, who would have been 8, 9 and 6, 7, and run across the road and say to them, do not stay on this side of the road, get over the road. And he was aware enough that what she was doing was wrong. So when we pulled up to pick him up, I think his dad would have been at the top of the hill and drove down the hill to pick him up. She'd already driven off, so it was really it was timed to perfection, which in itself is weird and wildly inappropriate. He jumped in the car, and having been told expressly not to say anything, the first thing he said to his dad was, Mormor was here. But Mormor had been at the bottom of the road, and he immediately let his dad know. Obviously then we spoke to police, we spoke to school to let school know, which then meant that the kids had their privilege of being able to come out of school and walk down the hill revoked. And the next day she was there again. She didn't think it was a problem. And I drove through and sat at the bottom of the hill, and she called over other people's children that she knows are friends of the kids to ask them where the kids were. Eyeballed me like I was the one in the wrong, and then drove off. And then a week later we got a solicitor's letter to say that she was planning on applying to have access, which is a whole other podcast episode. Yeah, she's turned up a couple of times where she's been accidentally driving past, is how she would phrase it, and sort of pulled over to the side of the road again to target Reuben. I think if she tried to speak to Toby would just ignore her and walk away. Edith would be upset and do the same, but Reuben in particular, he was so upset that time that she turned up at school the first time, and then when she tried to sort of corner him on the way home from secondary school, wouldn't walk round for days, wouldn't walk home for days. But it's that, how do you talk to them about it? How do you navigate it with them? Because it's so easy for children to clam up and not want to say the wrong thing, especially if they know there will be repercussions for saying the wrong thing, which he was so aware of with her. He knew that if he said the wrong thing, she would be nasty to him. He'd said to her, I've got to go, when she'd cornered him on the way back from secondary school, and she said to him, oh right, are you not allowed to speak to me then? And he said, she was really nasty about it, mummy. And I'd said, oh okay, and what did you say? He said, no, I said I've got to go to archery. And then she changed really quickly and was much nicer. And I thought, yeah, because she was going to have a go at you and belittle you and make you feel upset. And that's what she was trying to do with that sort of superior. Oh, you're not allowed to speak to me then, as if to say, you can't think for yourself. And he's an 11-year-old child. And yet he was quite quick to come home to discuss it, to say, I really don't like the way she does that to me, or the way that she has, like, he was funnily enough, and it was for his 10th birthday where he got the card. He was absolutely furious that he got one and his siblings hadn't, livid. Because he recognized, way more switched on than I ever was, how cruel that was.
How manipulative that is.
Yeah. And he recognized and then communicated to us how angry he was about that. And he'd asked us, we'd said to him, at the time we didn't tell him about it. And then the incident at the school had happened. We just threw it in the bin. And then we did say to him, look, we did get a card, but we didn't tell you because we didn't want to upset you. And he said, well, I understand that. I'm really cross that she sent one to me, but not to them. That's really unkind. Next time I want you to tell me, which we do now. If anything ever comes through for them, we say, or if there's any kind of contact, we say. We have that open communication. We learned that pretty early on.
Yeah.
But we have sort of learned that he needs that if we're to expect it from him.
Yeah. And for a while she was sending checks to me, and I know that was about looking to see when the check had been paid in or where it had been paid in, and I just used to put them in the bin. And it's making that decision on behalf of your kids isn't always clear cut. They have no relationship with her now. So, and I think because they were littler, it was a little bit easier to explain that if somebody's unkind to you, then you don't tolerate them any longer. And you've got a situation where you were all living together.
Yeah.
It's massive.
It was a really big one for them. And I remember after I asked her to move out, she'd said to Edith, well, will you come and look at houses on the internet with me because mummy's making me leave? I mean, how manipulative and toxic is that? And at the time, I didn't want to cut contact entirely. I was hoping that she would move out and that we would have a low contact at distance relationship. And she made that impossible. It was either we do things my way and I retain control over you, or we don't. And I think being able to explain to the children that we are healthier without her in our lives because of the way she treated me and the way she behaved towards me, towards Adam, and towards them is absolutely acceptable, because it doesn't matter who she is in relation to us. It's a case of we don't have to tolerate any kind of behavior that's mentally, physically, whatever, damaging to us in order to appease somebody else. Or in order to do what people think is right. It's a big one, isn't it?
It is huge. It is huge. And I'm in an estrangement group on Facebook, which is run by Sally Hughes, the beauty journalist. And I kind of read through the posts and I see the majority of the people are like low contact, then no contact, because low contact isn't something that particular kind of person can manage. A narcissist can't manage low contact.
Yeah, it's relinquishing the control, isn't it? It's a case of I'd rather have no relationship with you if I can't control you.
Yeah, and that's stopping contact. I can't remember how, but basically I knew that I'd stopped contact. I knew that Mum had written me out of her will, and that was the point where I thought, well, there we go. It was all conditional. I was only ever going to have money given to me if I behaved in a certain way. And once you don't behave in that way, that gets removed. But what she doesn't realise is that I actually don't care.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because it's used almost, and I hear this all, you will be taken out of the will. And it's amazing how, exactly. It's amazing how many people I speak to who've had that held over them. And especially in the economy that we live in now, let's be blunt, we are back to times when the majority need some kind of help from a parent in order to get on the property ladder, in order to create, it's a generational thing. We are back in those times when there are so many people who are relying on that coming at some point to help them through their older years, and then relying on what they've got to go to their it's not, to me, it's mad that that's used as a threat, full stop. And yet it's even wilder that it's expected that you would put up with abusive behavior on that basis, like for a cash payout. Like
if I let you treat me really badly, will I get any more?
Yeah, I mean, I know you're going to sell the house and stuff, Mum, but like, Is there like a nest egg?
Yeah.
Because I'm gonna need a higher payment, to be frank.
Yeah.
It's just wild that's, and I've had people say to me before, no, I will contest the will when they die because I feel owed, that I put up with this, that I was treated this way, and that is my nest egg and I need it for my children. And for me, that's not going to be the case. For me, I'm kind of like, I don't want anything from you. I didn't get anything from my dad when he passed away, not because I was taken out of his will, I believe. But that's, again, a whole other story. But I didn't want anything there. And he used my inheritance from my grandparents.
Yeah.
And I won't get anything from my mum. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm okay with it because I kind of think for the little checks that were coming through for birthday presents or something, when I looked at it, I thought, right, okay, so the kids have been sent 100 quid. What am I going to do with that 100 quid? Am I going to buy something that I'm going to look at and think, she paid for that? Or am I going to do something with it and we go out for the day and have a lovely day and I'm going to think she paid for that? I don't want that. She paid for that. I don't want that in my life. So therefore, my policy is the checks go in the bin.
Yeah.
They go in the bin. And if it's cash, I donate it to, there's a charity for families of alcoholics. So I just donate it because I just think, I don't want to profit from anything that she's got.
Yeah.
And somebody said something the other day, like they were talking about cards coming, and somebody said, don't worry about the card because literally everything that you need is outside that card.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the card, but it's still there, isn't it? You still think, oh,
it's still there. It still stings, but I actually really like that. Don't worry about the card because everything that you need and that you have is outside of that card. That card has no power over you. And I love that. Yeah. And I think, I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to react to them. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to deal with the gifts that are sent, whether you donate them, keep them, give them to the kids, don't give them to the kids, throw the checks in the bin, cash the checks. I don't think there's any right or wrong way there. It's what feels right to you and what is within your comfort level. And I think, again, it goes back to those setting your personal boundaries, to knowing yourself and to allowing your sense of self to prevail on that one. Will I be looking at it and thinking, she bought that? Will I be looking at it and thinking, okay, that money's sat in my kid's bank, but then that gives her a chance to come back in a few years and say, look at all this money that I gave to you, I've set you up? Or will you not look at it that way, and will you just look at it as a thanks, my kids will benefit from that, I'm not interested? And I don't think there's ever a right or a wrong way to deal with these things, but the only thing that is a problem is when you allow it to negatively impact you and you allow it to have a power over you.
Like I always feel like I want a plan, like I want a policy for what happens when certain thing happens. And I was talking to my therapist about it, and she said, what's the thing that's getting you at the moment? It's like, it could be anything, but actually, what am I going to do when somebody rings and says she's dead? What are you going to do? And I was like, okay, so the first thing I will do is I will ring my husband and I'll say she's dead. She was like, and then what? I said, I don't know, because I don't want to do a funeral. I don't want any part in this. And I knew that by saying those words that somebody else would be thinking, somebody else with a standard relationship with their mum would be thinking, oh my God, you don't want to do a funeral. And I was like, no, I was listening to Radio 4 the other day, and there's a thing called straight to cremation, and you can just cremate them. You don't have to have a funeral. You don't have to go to the crematorium. None of it actually has to happen.
Oh, right.
And once I'd got that in my head that was what I was going to do, I felt much better about it. And just knowing that those normal social conventions of family relations, you don't have to do what everybody expects you to do. You can make that choice now. Whereas in the past, if I was still in touch with her, I would have jumped through the hoops and I would have done what everybody expected.
But not what's right for you.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
I didn't actually know about that. And I guess I should be my mum's next of kin, but I would presume she will have taken me off and put her sister on. So,
but how do you do that?
I have no idea. No idea. I don't know if it's just when you fill out the forms I know my mum attended hospital quite a lot for problems with arthritis and that kind of thing. So it could just be that when she's filled out the forms, and she used to work in the NHS, so it's quite possible that she would know her way around changing forms. But I've never had contact. She might well have left me on there. I suspect there is an element of spite in leaving someone on there when you know they don't want to be on there. I would be her next of kin if we were going off the standard. I don't have a plan for what happens when someone will tell me. I get a lot of people will say to me, especially when I get DMs telling me I'm evil, that, you know, I'll regret it when she dies. And I won't. I'd imagine, and again, I'm speculating because she hasn't yet, but I'd imagine that it'll be a mixed bag of feelings, but one of those feelings will be relief.
Yeah. And I said I will definitely take some time off work because I want to allow those feelings to work through.
Yes.
Just knowing like what my plan is made a difference, because initially I was just like, well, we'll just get on a plane and we'll go to Disney.
Yeah. I like that idea, actually. Do you know what? I'm going to go with your original idea. To be honest,
just get on a plane.
Is that not, you know, not to therapize you, but is that not running away a little bit?
Oh, is it?
I mean,
we can't run away from something that can't get you anymore.
Disney sounds like a cracking shout, to be honest, but I didn't know that you could just do a straight to cremation and not have anything to do with it, so that's going to be really useful for listeners.
Isn't it gruesome though?
It is, but you know, I'll bet I've spoken to people before whose family, long lost family member that they have never had any contact with, they've been contacted as technically the next of kin and asked, do you want to do anything because they've died? And they're like, I don't even know that person, I never even met them, why would I want to pay for a funeral? Why would I want to? The only thing that I do know, and that I think I would do for her, I know she wanted to be either interred or buried with her children, and I would try and make sure that happened for her. I think probably shouldn't. I should probably just say, if it came down to me, sod it, I'm not getting involved in that, just cremate her and get rid. But I think from my point of view, I would try to do that for her because I think that damaged her quite significantly, and I would either pass that on to someone else to do, but make them aware that that was her wish,
that was what she wanted.
I think I would, because losing a child and losing all three of them, I would want, I think, just as that was what you asked.
Well, it's the right thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it just? Probably quite an emotional toll. I've never, like I say, I've not really given it too much thought, and I probably should, because she's quite a bit older and she's never been particularly well, so probably should have a plan.
Make a plan.
I
mean, mine started with having when I thought I had to do a funeral was to have I Forgot That You Existed by Taylor Swift.
Do you know anybody listening to this who is hearing it and thinking, oh my God, that's so callous? I'm telling you now, it's not.
It's not.
It's not, because the level of ill treatment, the level of, call it what it is, abuse, because I really struggle to acknowledge it as abuse as well. Even my own stigmatized view of behaviors, I still struggle to think that was abusive. Yeah, if you ask me, and you say that, my therapist will often say, okay, well, what if that was your child? I'm like, no, that's abusive. But because it was me, I'm like, oh. But if you listen to this and you're thinking, oh my God, this is so callous, like, how could you even think about things in this way? Trust me, when you have been through that experience, you can
and you need the humor as well. You need the gallows humor to be able to get through it, otherwise it just becomes even more too much. And like, I've done enough safeguarding training over the years to know categorically it's emotional abuse and neglect, and there's no two ways about it, because, like, you know, when people say, yeah, but they didn't hit you, well, they also didn't do very much else either.
And it's like you say, it's that gallows humor. There is nothing like somebody who has lived childhood trauma to have a really wicked sense of humor. You know,
it's true.
It's true. And that if you are listening to it and you are thinking, oh, I feel like I should feel bad, but that's exactly what I've said in the privacy of my own home. I won't dare say it on a podcast, but that's what I've said. I've sort of made joke or been flippant. Please know there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Humor.
And those people are our people.
Yeah, you are my people. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging and poking fun at your own experience in order to be able to cope with it and rationalize it, because that's what you're doing. It's really common for people who work in emergency services as well. They say that is largely down to being able to deal with trauma, is because if you can disassociate from it and joke about it, it makes it easier to deal with. So it's not an uncommon thing to have that dark humor, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with you if you do. It doesn't mean that your empathy compass is broken because you've got oodles of empathy for people who deserve it.
There's quite a lot of dark jokes in our house.
There are in ours as well. I cannot thank you enough.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Coming and chatting to me and sharing your experience and letting people know that they aren't alone. Obviously, the alcoholism side of things is not something that I can offer, but I feel that it will be incredibly relatable to so many people who have lived that experience, even if it's not the alcoholism, if it's a different kind of addiction, or if it's a different kind of medical need where that's been put upon you, and yet you're expected to kind of almost adds another layer of, but you know she's ill, so you've got to be the one looking after them, and that makes it incredibly difficult.
I mean, it was quite reassuring when she was still terrible when she was sober.
I can imagine it was, because then you'd know that it's not just the addiction, it's not just the medical need. This is her as a person, and it's amplified by those things.
And estrangement is a really tough subject, but it is absolutely fascinating.
It is. And I hear a lot now about people talking about estrangement being on the rise. And I think in one way it is, because we are becoming more aware of mental abuse. We're becoming more aware of the damage of the mother wound, the father wound, the way that in which our childhood can impact us. But equally, I don't think it's necessarily just because it's becoming, somebody referred to it as an estrangement craze the other week. And I don't necessarily think that it is becoming that much more common. I think it's increased in how often we're seeing it happen, but it's not just that. It's because people are being more open about it. And that's what really counts, is there is healing within community. There really is.
And connections. And people didn't talk about miscarriage 5 years ago. Things change, and things change for the better. I don't think it'll stop narcissism.
No.
I don't think it'll stop people making poor choices. And talking about it gives people the opportunity to make a change that they can have control of and work a way through it and have a plan and, think it through. If nobody talks about it, then nobody gets any better. It's got to be talked about and talked through. And there's so many parts of it, how it related to work, how it related to self-esteem, the body image. It goes on and on and on. And you're terrified that you're going to do part of it to somebody. But the fact that you're aware of it must mean that you're not going to.
It's trusting in yourself to be aware enough of your behaviour and to be accountable for the times that you do make mistakes, because we all do. We all want to make mistakes, but to be able to say, okay, actually, I didn't like how that made me feel or how I made someone else feel. So I'm going to address that and work on that. And that's what counts.
I was over the moon to see that you were going to do the podcast. Really, really just yes, this could be really, really good. And I think it will be. People need something to go to, do you know what I mean? Where they feel like they've got an audience there that they know are going through something that is similar.
And everything that I'd researched and looked for was for the parent of the adult child that had cut off. And I'd said to Adam, I'm not taking away from the fact that community is useful for those people. I think that everybody deserves community. Everybody deserves to have a place where they can speak to other people, even if I don't agree with them, even if it's not my bag. But why was there nothing out there for the adult child that's gone, this is enough? And it's because it's so shrouded in shame and because you're so judged. And I wanted to try and lift some of that. So hopefully that is what we are doing.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. Honestly, it's been really enlightening talking to you, and just like I said, that there is that healing in community. There is that power in knowledge, in knowing that you're not the only one that's gone through it, in knowing that no matter what the variations of the stories might be and what the different experiences might be, this is how somebody's come to terms with their experience. This is what they have dealt with. You're not alone in it. And there is kind of that happy, fulfilling life that you lead. that hasn't got them in it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the big thing, isn't it? I hear quite a lot of, oh, well, if you really forgave them, you know, that would help. Forgiveness is for you. You can forgive someone and not have them in your life, and you can choose not to forgive them and move on. You
And
don't
also,
owe anyone that.
I don't think there's any relief in estrangement.
No.
Like, I think people thought, oh, you must be so relieved now. No, I don't feel relieved. Nothing feels lighter now.
You're just able to
I'm
process
just
that
safer.
safer.
Yeah.
You can process that trauma at your own pace without having more
Yeah.
added to it and having it
Yeah.
compounded all the time. And that is the important thing. And I get, you know, this podcast is set up for people who are cycle breakers. So we're not kind of trying to encourage anyone to become estranged if that's not the path that works for
Yeah.
them. But if you are estranged, if you have made the decision to go no contact as opposed to low contact, or as opposed to just trying to navigate the dysfunction in the relationship, perhaps you'll have a parent who is trying to work on themselves and is being accountable for their hand in the damage of the relationship. Again, that's absolutely fine. It's never going to be a one size fits all. But if you are in that position of estrangement, it's knowing that what you have chosen to do for yourself and for your family and your future isn't wrong. Thank you so much for coming on, guys. If you do want to find Helene, then you can find her at Merrymint on Instagram. I'm super grateful to you for chatting to me, and we will speak to you again next week, guys.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.